Good evening, everyone. Hi, I hope you guys all arrived safely on the final day that we actually have good Pittsburgh weather. I'm so excited for it to be gray tomorrow. My name is Colin Winder, and I'm a junior broadcast reporting major here at Point Park University. And as a long-standing problem in the NFL and other sports organizations, diversity in leadership now more than ever is needed, not only to showcase an effort towards diversity, but work with and implement improvements with the vast amount of diverse minds that will no doubt benefit these organizations. As a student, as a person of color, and as a woman, coming into the workforce, especially when I'm aiming to a leadership position, I'm excited to be in the room with the people that are spearheading these projects for our future. Sports or not, I'd like to introduce a person that values this sentiment, Managing Director for the Center for Media Innovation, Andrew Conte. But first, I'd like to say, go Ravens!
That was tough. Yeah, that was a tough setup after all this. Yeah, she threatened to do it. I think Jeremy might have put her up to it. I'm not sure. But thanks all for being here tonight. This conversation couldn't come at a more important time for our country. With the questions that are being raised about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and questions about what merit means and merit-based hiring means. The words that have been used on one side are being used by the other side, and it's mixed up the whole thing. But as someone who grew up as a Steelers fan, Kalyan, here we go. It was really, and when I was working on my book, The Color of Sundays, it was really a joy to find out that my team was not only doing what was right, but that at the time it was doing what was right also meant that it gained a competitive advantage. And from my perspective, that really is what set the Steelers apart and sets them apart as an organization. And so I'm excited for that part of the conversation tonight. I also want to say that our first speaker, Tim Stevens, is going to say a few words to get us kind of set for tonight. But if you catch Tim at the right time, maybe like mid-morning after he's been out at the club the night before, talking to him is a little bit like listening to jazz, and he just kind of riffs and it goes. And that's because he's been there, he's been living it. Tim founded the BPEP, the Black Political Empowerment Project, in 1986, I think, in the 1980s. 40 years, yeah. And he was the president of the NAACP for 10 years here in Pittsburgh. He's been a leader in terms of community and police relations. And for me personally, he's founded something called the Community and the Corporate Equity and Inclusion Roundtable. And that's a vehicle that Tim uses to bring the Rooney Rule into corporate boardrooms and C-suites across southwestern Pennsylvania. And so when I reached out to Tim and told him what we wanted to do tonight, he graciously accepted. And I was really grateful for that because, Tim, you're really the one that opened up my eyes to this idea that the Rooney Rule is not just for sports, but for all of us. So please join me in welcoming Tim Stevens.
Very good. Oh, nice picture. I'm going to be talking quickly, so put your fast ears on. First of all, let me thank Andrew Conte, the director of the Center for Media Innovation here at Point Park University, for his kind introduction. And we met years ago partnering with the BPEP Jazz fundraiser when we had to produce virtually because of COVID. And it's good to be with you, Andrew, when we don't have to wear masks. So that's a good thing. I want to also acknowledge the immediate past president of the NAACP Pittsburgh branch, who is now the Black Political Empowerment Project's social justice advocate. Give him a hand over there, Dalen A. Davis. He had a lot to do with this presentation that we put together for tonight. And we also have one of our bee peppers here, as we call ourselves, H.P. Jackson. The road to the Rooney Rule was marked by courage, conviction, and by an unyielding spirit of those who dared to believe in justice. Tonight we trace the story of NFL's Rooney Rule from its humble beginnings in 2003 to its sweeping impact on the game we love, and we confront the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. We recall why this policy was born and how it has reshaped the league, and why, in the face of a White House-led push against diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, and the principles that this term stands for, we must stand firm to ensure the dream of equal opportunity does not fade away. In December of 2002, a clarion call for justice echoed through the NFL owners' meetings pushed by the advocacy of attorneys Cyrus Mehri and the famous Johnny Cochran in partnership with the Fritz Pollard Alliance. And by the start of the 2003, the Rooney Rule was born. An edict that would require each team to interview at least one ethnic minority candidate for every head coach vacancy was born in the ashes of a grievous oversight. The firings of Tony Dungy and Dennis Green, two of the league's finest leaders, denied the chance to compete with other head coaching positions, despite their sterling records. Named for Dan Rooney, as we know, the Pittsburgh Steelers owner who chaired the league's Workplace Diversity Committee, whose moral compass guided the league toward a higher calling, the rule declared that diversity was not optional. It was essential to the integrity of the game. And so in faith and fellowship, the NFL's owners embraced a new principle, that talent knows no color, and that by casting a wider net, the league would enrich not only its rosters, but its very soul. In its early years, the Rooney Rule sent a ripple through the league's power structure, compelling franchises to look beyond the familiar faces and lean into untapped wells of wisdom and experience, such as our own Mike Tomlin, who won his first Super Bowl in 2009. By 2009, the rules scope had broadened. Front office positions, including general managers, senior football operations, were now subject to the same mandate, ensuring that opportunity extended beyond the sidelines. In 2020, the NFL went further still, offering compensatory draft picks to teams that lost minority coaches or executives to other franchises, a tangible incentive that transformed interviews into genuine quests for excellence. And in 2021, the requirement evolved again. Teams were instructed to interview not one, but at least two minority candidates for head coaching positions or vacancies, a testament to our collective yearning for deeper, and more enduring change. Today, the fruits of these labors are visible on stadium sidelines and in front offices across the land. And a record 9 minority heads coaches lead teams in the 24, has led teams in 2024, up from 3 in 2003. A milestone that speaks to progress, yet reminds us of the work still undone. And at the head of the end of 2023 season, roughly 28% of general managers were people of color, more than triple the percentage from 2 decades prior, affirming that when doors are opened, talent will walk through. Yet even as we celebrate, we must acknowledge the limits of progress. The lawsuit filed by Brian Flores laid bare the danger of hollow compliance, the sham interviews and checkbox rituals that mock the spirit of the rule and betray the promise of genuine inclusion. Still, year after year, season after season, the Rooney Rule has taught us that true equity depends on vigilance if the promise of fairness is to be upheld. In 2013, at the request of the Black Political Empowerment Project, BPEP, and BPEP's Corporate Equity and Inclusion Roundtable, Steeler President Art Rooney II gave full permission for us to adopt the Rooney Rule and to expand its meanings into culture, the culture of corporations and universities and colleges and nonprofits throughout the region, and indeed spoke at the first CEI conference in 2013 at Duquesne University. On the last day of Black History Month, 2023, February 28, 2023, the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Pittsburgh Steelers announced a historic news conference held at Acrisure Stadium with a video welcome from Art Rooney II, the adoption of the BPEP-CR Playbook for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which includes adoption of what we call the comprehensive Rooney Rule with results, which calls for the consideration of African Americans for entry-level jobs all the way to the C-suite, and consideration of African Americans for all contractual opportunities. It doesn't mean that blacks all of a sudden will be getting all the jobs. It means that blacks will be getting the opportunity to be considered. The playbook provides a variety of specific steps and actions along with a timeline that any employer can use who has a true commitment to leveling the playing field for African Americans throughout the Pittsburgh region and beyond. And Jim, the first inner page of the playbook features a welcome from your brother. And of course, Mr. Rooney chairs the NFL's Workplace Diversity Committee. He's also committed to share the playbook with all of his fellow owners of the NFL, along with the Steeler-produced video on the playbook. It's clear that Art Rooney II has truly followed in the historic footsteps of his father. Because of the recent vicious attacks on the term diversity, equity, and inclusion, however, BPEP and CEIR have made language changes in the playbook so we can get it into the building of these corporations. It's now called Strategies for Creating Opportunities Through Retention and Engagement, SCORE. We've kept that sports theme. However, it's important to note that the strategies remain the same. By now, my friends, it's clear that a new challenge confronts us all, not on the gridiron, but in the halls of government. January 2025, the Executive Order 14151 was signed into law, mandating the termination, quote, of all mandates, policies, programs, preferences, and activities relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, end of quote, across the federal government. Yet, the U.S. continues to experience the largest racial gap in the last quarter century, with white families having 8 times the wealth of African American families. This was a declaration that the hard-won gains towards equity were to be swept aside in favor of a narrow view of something called, quote-unquote, merit. But you can see how the merit has not worked in certain appointments. But this view is unmoored from the realities of systematic and continuous inequality. Schools and universities are threatened with funding cuts unless they surrender their DEI initiatives. A chilling echo of segregationist policies we once thought related to history. Across our nation, governors and legislators scramble to comply, resist. Our democratic institutions strain under the weight of questions that cut to the core of our ideals. Do we stand for equal opportunity, or do we retreat into the shadows of our basest fears? While the NFL stands as a private entity immune to direct federal decree, it cannot escape the tide of cultural change that flows from our Capitol to every locker room and every boardroom. If we allow the White House's repudiation of DEI to go unchallenged, we risk undermining the very foundations upon which the Rooney Rule was built, foundations of respect, foundations of opportunity, foundations of the belief that every individual deserves fair access. Imagine a day when interviews become mere formalities, when the most qualified voices are silenced. Let us resolve that the NFL will not stand idly by. Let every team owner, let every coach, let every player, every fan raise their voices in unison, declaring that we choose love over fear, we choose unity and over division, and we choose justice over complacency. And if ever there are those who would ask, is this dream too bold? We will answer with every hire, answer with every interview, every policy that lifts up the unheard. No dream is too bold for people who believe in justice. My friends, the arc of progress may bend slowly, but it bends toward justice only when we tug at it with the strength of our convictions. Let us tug together. Let us stand for the Rooney Rule. Let's not abolish it. Let's build upon it. Let us stand for the principles of opportunity, engagement, and retention. Let us stand for the dream. For when the next generation looks back, they will not remember how we wavered in the face of adversity. Hopefully, they will remember how we lifted our voices, how we held firm, and how we chose once again to let freedom ring. To let freedom ring. Thank you very much.
I told you, right? He was amazing. Thanks so much, Tim, for that. Really setting the stage for tonight's discussion and why it matters so much. Really appreciate it. I'm going to introduce our two speakers for tonight, and then I'll ask them to come up and join me on the stage, and we'll have a conversation. And those of you who've been with us before know that I like to involve everybody in the conversation, so we'll look forward to that. Our first speaker this evening, Jeremi Duru, is a leading sports law expert because he's lived it. He's a professor at American University's Washington School of Law, and he's held cases in front of or he's worked on business legal cases with the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball. He's done all of it. The main thing is he's written this book that's really incredible, Advancing the Ball. It's really I think the best book on the Rooney Rule. It really takes you inside the room and brings you there to moments like when the Fritz-Pollard Alliance came together, and Jeremi's a board member of the Fritz-Pollard Alliance. And if you don't know what that is, we're going to get to it in a few minutes. You should know what it is. And then our other speaker, Jim Rooney. All of us look up to our dads, right? But Jim, when he looked up to his dad, it's really special. Of course, Ambassador Rooney not only owned the Steelers, but turned them from a franchise that I once told your dad the team was terrible before he came along, and he was like, "Well, we were just mediocre." But they had only been to the playoffs 2 times before the Super Bowl runs, and so the book. Jim's book talks about how his dad kept notes on everyone in the organization, from the top of the organization all the way down to the ball boy, and had a clear idea of what everyone's role was and how all those pieces fit together to make a championship team. And then, in his free time, Ambassador Rooney, worked for peace in Ireland. And it's incredible that, he was working behind the scenes a long time before when peace seemed impossible in Ireland. And then when he became ambassador, he made a big deal about going to all 32 counties of Ireland. And, when you're here, you're kind of like, the 60-some counties in Pennsylvania, like not a big deal. But then you realize that in Ireland, 6 of the counties are in a different country. And of course, they're, this is been divided by war and strife. And for him to go there and to be such a positive representative of the United States and to have such an impact that he did was incredible. And then, of course, he shaped the modern day NFL. And in Jim's book, he talks too about it's not, we're going to talk about the Rooney Rule tonight, which is super important, but I didn't realize that Ambassador Rooney also was, the person who helped figure out the television deals for the NFL, and that really formed the modern NFL, and that, made sacrifices to integrate the American Football League into the NFL, and to, have the Steelers switch to the American Football Conference. But of course, he's not just his father's son. Jim's, a leader in his own right. He's got his degree from Boston College, has a consulting business with clients such as the federal government, Coppers, the University of Pittsburgh, BNY Mellon, and he serves on the board of the Jewish Healthcare Foundation and the American Ireland Funds. Please join me in welcoming Jeremi and Jim to the stage.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I should say, too, that these guys are basically volunteering their time to be here. When I reached out and said, I hope to have a conversation about the Rooney Rule, and you both bought into it, and Jim was like, yeah, we're definitely doing it, and oh, by the way, I'm bringing Jeremi, and you're going to love him. It's going to be amazing, and it's been great. But when we started having that conversation, we were just talking about, it'd be cool to have a conversation about the Rooney Rule, and it wasn't weighted with all of the pressures that Tim talked about tonight. And I wonder if, Jeremi, if you could kick us off with, talking about your perspective on the Rooney Rule and where it plays its role in the world today, in the United States today, not just the sports.
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for having me. Thank you, Tim, for those remarks, and thank you for the warm introduction. Maybe I'll start with, I want to talk about the Rooney Rule's place today, but I want to talk a little about history, if I could,
Yeah,
to
please.
talk about how we got to where we are. Tim talked about the import of the NFL clubs coming together to agree to the Rooney Rule, but it definitely was not peaches and cream to get there. The league was born in segregation and racial strife. When the league came to being in 1920, any American historians in this room recognize what the world was like then and what this country was like for black folks, perilous. And it was no easier for the few black NFL players. They were attacked during games, essentially piled upon. They were attacked at practices. They were disrespected and humiliated. And then a few years after the league's founding, they were all kicked out. All the owners agreed we don't want any black players in the league anymore, and they expurgated them. And so it wasn't until 1946 that we had the resegregation of the league. And when we had the resegregation of the league, the reintegration, the desegregation of the league, it didn't integrate evenly. So for those of you who have been watching football for a long time, it's just recently that we've had this renaissance of black quarterbacks, for example. When the league desegregated in 1946, black quarterbacks were not a thing. It wasn't permitted, quite frankly. Black middle linebackers were not a thing. Black centers were not a thing. Black guards were a very rare thing, and it took decades until you started to see these players come into these positions. So why the positional stacking, as it's called? Well, because there's a sense that the quarterback position, middle linebacker position, these are intelligence positions. These are leadership positions. These are professionalism positions, and black players were brought into the quote-unquote speed positions, the quote-unquote strength positions. And so as a consequence of that, as you moved over the course of the century and you got toward the end of it, you found yourself in a situation where you've got a league now that's majority black. Those positions are still somewhat segregated, the quarterback position very segregated. You can only imagine what the coaching position was. There were no black coaches. There was no sense that black individuals had the merit to be coaches. And that's something that endured really up until the turn of the century, to the time that Tim was talking about. And so I wanted to give that history so we could ground owners. The league has not always been a place where people of color have been accepted. It's not always been a place where owners have come together to do the right thing. But it got to be that way over time for, among other reasons, there were some owners who were held positions of power in the league, but also had developed their clubs in a way that made them better through considering diversity and inclusion. And the Pittsburgh Steelers are top on that list. And I think that's why you both were lauding Dan Rooney earlier, because he came up with a way to be better through being fair and being equitable.
Yeah. Jim, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, well, first of all, thank you for the book. I mean, it's really a terrific to hear from someone inside the family describing what the Rooney Rule meant to you and to the family, and your dad's role in the NFL. But could you talk specifically about his commitment to diversity and merit hiring? You mentioned in the book about he was invited to go to the Walk to Selma, right? And didn't go, but always regretted that. What were some of his other motivations behind this?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, and I'm certainly not advocating Christianity here tonight, but I think it's interesting that, you know, this is in the Christian tradition, this is the time when Christ was denied. Tonight was you know, when he was denied. And both my father and my grandfather were really amazing pioneers. What my grandfather did with black baseball, I remember talking to Evan Baker, who was Cumberland Posey's nephew, and he said, you know, Art Rooney was so important to the Crawfords getting, or the Grays getting money and starting. My grandfather, you know, worked with you know, so many folks in the Hill District, and you know, with Bill Nunn's father, who we don't talk as much about. And then he had this boxing business that was just a leader when it comes to black boxing. Art Rooney was the promoter of the first open heavyweight title fight between Ezra Charles and Jersey Wolcott, of two black men in American history. So I'm proud of that. Those are good things. But my grandfather didn't step up when they threw the black players out of the league in '33, and the Steelers had a black player, Ray Kemp, in the first season of the Steelers' history. And same with my father, as you brought up, that he was invited to go down to Selma. And, you know, he talked about he was afraid. You know, he was a young father, and, you know, there was rationale. And look, I've certainly been afraid of doing things, but I think that it's so important in this moment to bring those pieces too, because I'm so proud of what both those men did, and they came up short. And what happens, and I think particularly when we talk about my grandfather in this case, when a group, you know, does something that is against what you believe in, and how do we all, I think we all do this to some degree, and you know, my grandfather's example is so clear. How do we come short because we're part of the group, and the group is deciding to do something that is short of what we believe in, and short of our principles? And I want to make sure that's part of this story, because I don't know what's going to happen going forward, but we're in a moment of crisis when it comes to the opportunities for, in my mind, every minority in America, and you know, how are we going to respond to that? And I'm not going to sit here and say I have some perfect answer, but I did see both of these men step forward, admit, hey, they got some things wrong, and then, you know, how do you then own up to your limitations, your moments of weakness, and then say, no, I missed that, but, you know, my grandfather went forward with the boxing. My dad doesn't go to Selma, you know, says in the business plan that we talk about there that, you know, he wants the Steelers to be one of the most highly segregated teams in the NFL, yet they don't do that for the first 8 years. And it takes Bill Nunn criticizing him in the Pittsburgh Courier for him to say, this is something I believe in and I'm not getting it done, and sitting down with Bill. And then as you wrote in your book, as you've talked about, as I've talked in my book, you know, Bill Nunn becomes this catalyst for change for the Steelers and for the NFL that I think is certainly every bit as significant. Well, I don't want to say every bit as significant, but as significant as Jackie Robinson, because to me, what Bill did, the Steelers did. Now there's a few folks in the AFL did it, but moving forward, and we can. I'm kind of talking about a lot of things here at once. I don't want to. But what Bill did was transform a 50-person team. And that's what an organization starts to look at. And pioneers are great, and we need Jackie Robinsons, and we need Joe Lewis's, and we need motivational experiences that we look at, inspirational experiences. But the real transformation will happen when you get the Steelers of the 70s, and you get 60% of that team is coming from not HBCUs, but backgrounds that no one else was coming from, and then that team just completely dominates. Because there was a commitment to diversity that was true, and it was thorough, and it was throughout the organization. So I'm proud of my father and certainly my grandfather's contribution to that, but it was also, being wrong and coming to the conclusion that that's not who they wanted to be, and then having a guy like Bill Nunn, hold up to my father saying, "You say this is what you want to do, you're not doing it." And then having that sort of moment of, I do want to be different. I do want to do something different.
Thank you for that answer, because I think that's something that a lot of us have wondered about, the Steelers in 1933 and the, I don't know if it's guilt or regret for not saying something in that moment and not doing more, and then sort of devoting the rest of your life to correcting what you maybe perceived as a mistake.
And the chief did. He said that was the biggest mistake of his life, because right next to the team was the boxing, which he was doing the exact opposite of. So sorry
right.
to cut
No,
you
it's
off
perfect.
there.
It's well, in that time in 1933, because there's no record of the owners actually saying, "Oh, this is what we're going to do." They just did it. So just to level set too on the Bill Nunn piece of it. So Nunn was the main character of my book, A Color of Sundays, and Nunn was a newspaper reporter here for the Pittsburgh Courier when the Courier was the nation's black newspaper. Even though it was the Pittsburgh Courier, it had 14 bureaus across the country, and so you had reporters and readers in Los Angeles and Miami and Seattle and all these different places across the country. And I often remind my students now about why that was so significant and why the Pittsburgh Courier. You think about a time before the internet, right? And so if you're a black person living almost anywhere in the United States and you want to find out what's going on about black culture in the United States or in other black communities, you're relying on white, before the internet's mostly powerful, white, wealthy, politically connected people who owned the newspapers, who owned the radio stations. You had to have enough money to have a printing press. And so the Courier filled that need by having people send in their stories from across the country, reporters who would literally call in. So when the Cleveland Rams moved to Los Angeles and reintegrated the NFL, it was because there was also a reporter there from the Pittsburgh Courier who was in the room and said, and asked the question: if you're going to have this team play in a public coliseum, the public facility, shouldn't you open up the tryouts to everyone? And they did. And so Jim's grandfather and uncle, I guess, really offered a job to. Well, your dad and your uncle offered the job to Bill Nunn to come down and be a scout for the Steelers. And from Nunn's telling, he was like, no, I'm not going to do it. Right? He was like, no, you've ignored the Courier. You've never asked me for my opinion. There was some question about where he sat in the press box, but there was a sincere commitment. And then Nunn goes on to be a scout who identifies all these players that were at historically black colleges and universities that I think that by that point the teams knew that there were quality players there, but they really didn't know how to identify them or how to, bring them to their team. So, Jeremi, I wonder if you would talk about this issue of merit-based hiring and the words that we use, because in your books you both talk about this idea that what makes the Rooney Rule so unique is that it creates an opportunity. And for somebody to be hired based on their ability and not the way they look or any other thing that would divide us. And yet, at the same time, now we hear those same words being used to push back against diversity and equity and inclusion.
Yes, and Tim went to that in his remarks as well, and it's really I don't know, offensive. I'm offended. Mm-hmm. I'm offended by the way that a lot of people have sought to kind of pervert the concepts of diversity and inclusion and equity, and deride the term DEI, and then deride each of those concepts, right. As if what they're looking for is homogeneity and exclusion in inequitability. And so it's painful and offensive, but as you point out, our point is that we have to make sure there's meritocracy and everybody's got an opportunity. And then they take those same exact words and say we need meritocracy, and they then juxtapose it with concepts of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And what you realize is happening is that there are very different presumptions behind the two different perspectives. Mm-hmm. So our presumption is that you can't have a meritocratic assessment if everyone hasn't been given opportunity. There's no way to do that. It's impossible. It's a failing enterprise. Right. You have to make sure everyone has an opportunity. Once you do that, then let's get to it. Yeah. Let's see who's best. Right. And their perspective is a presumption that if you are of color or a woman, you've gotten to a place without consideration of meritocracy. You know, you're a DEA, it doesn't matter. Know nothing about your history, know nothing about the interview process, know nothing about the job post, know nothing about anything. But if you're a person of color in this position, oh, they're a DEI hire. And it is a fundamentally racist and sexist position that if you are of color or you are a woman, then you can't win the meritocratic race. And so that's, as in so many things today, and so unfortunate in the public conversation, there are the starting points of conversations are so different that you can use the same words, but they mean totally different things.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so where do we end up on that then today? I guess, Jim, you talked about this feeling of regret for not doing more, but we live in a time now where all of us are sort of being asked to, what is the line and what are we willing to do in this time? And how have you reflected on that?
Yeah, I try to think about my father because there's certainly millions and millions of people that have done things greater than he did, but I was next to him so often, whether it was in Ireland, whether it was working with the NFL and issues that really went beyond the Rooney Rule, what Tony Dungy called the spirit of the Rooney Rule. And a couple of things I reflect on. One is, I never saw my father capitulate, but he was also a realist. I remember in Ireland, when the most extreme people would take over the government, you would go through these periods in Ireland where there would be a lot of violence, and the British, and I'm not trying to pick sides here, but that they would really put a strong man in charge of and then there would be a pushback over a 5-10 year period, and then you would get a more reasonable person leading Northern Ireland. And my father always said the biggest thing he tried to make sure happened in those periods when you had the most extreme was that you didn't go backwards too far. Mm-hmm. And I know that's not what we all want to hear all the time, but there was a reality that he saw in Northern Ireland with the violence, but the way Northern Ireland played out, and I don't go too far down this road, but it was playing out in housing, it was playing out in inequitable education, it was playing out in access to capital, it was playing out in the dynamics in terms of wealth. Everything that we've ever talked about with civil rights in America was happening in Northern Ireland. So he was using things he had learned here to take over there, and he really focused on the economic side. He really felt that if you, put folks in Northern Ireland in positions where you had, shared, all of they did a lot with different incubators and things like that. And they would say, okay, you have to be as close to 50-50 Protestant as Catholic as you can. You're never going to get 50-50 exactly, but that he would set those goals. But his commitment was to education into the economics, because he really believed that if you make a change in someone's economic situation, they're not going to choose violence. They're going to choose alternatives, and so those were commitments he made. So that was the basis. But to your question, he knew that when things were kind of really difficult, he would do more of the groundwork of the, making sure that there was a commitment to that the incubators were working well, that the kids were getting to the integrated schools that they were working with. So that's an example I know. I don't want to say that's the only one, because I do think there are times we have to stand and be loud. And I'm not the one to know exactly when you go which way, but that was a perspective I saw with him that I think a lot about Northern Ireland when I think about the moment we're in right now.
In the book you talk about him being an idealist, but also a pragmatist. That's what you're talking about. That you can have these ideas, but at the same time you have to say, like, what can we accomplish today? And I think that was an interesting part of it too. That his willingness to put himself out there and to to go to Northern Ireland, and as a Catholic person whose family was from Northern Ireland, to reach out and incorporate the Protestants there. Do you think that was part of it, the fact that the family is Catholic but was from Northern Ireland? Is that a part of his ability to see?
Yeah, I think he learned over and over. I think he saw, Jeremy talked about, and I kind of glossed over the black boxing. But for folks who don't know, what was happening in boxing in America is you had Joe Louis, who was the heavyweight champion, and really that was bigger in some ways than Jackie Robinson. We reflect so much on Jackie Robinson, as we should, but what Joe Louis had done was also amazing, because boxing was so popular. But in the rest of boxing, outside of the heavyweight championship, the big fight, you had what you called these black-white grudge matches. And effectively, black men were being maimed and killed in the boxing ring, and it was fundamentally being sanctioned. And, the chief was at 1 million fights, and my father was at them when he was young. So I think that had a huge influence on him to say, how can I make a difference with race in America? But I think the experience in race in America took him to Ireland.
Yeah.
But I think Ireland then took him to the Rooney Rule. I try to think that each step he learned along the way, like, okay, there's real challenges here. What are the pragmatic steps we can take to make a difference?
Right. Jeremy, I wonder if you could take us now inside the room with the Fritz Pollard Alliance and this gathering of black men who are involved in the NFL and gathering together and around Tony Dungy and saying, we're gonna stick together. Because I think in the book you described that exactly what we're talking about. It took a great deal of courage to walk in there and say, well, I don't know how this is going to impact the rest of my career, the rest of my ability to be in the NFL, but I believe that it's time for me to do something.
Sure. And so.
And who was Fritz Pollard?
Yeah, so Fritz Pollard, I saw a few things here. I'm so glad you asked this question. So Fritz Pollard, remember I talked about those days when there were just a few black players in the league and they were, essentially set upon during games. Fritz Pollard was a running back for a club called the Akron Pros. They're now defunct, obviously, but in the very early stages of the NFL. And he actually developed this means of protecting himself when he got tackled. He'd spin onto his back as quickly as possible and then start kicking his feet in the air like riding a bicycle to kick anybody who tried to pile on him, because it was so frequent the black players would be piled on and injured. So he ended up, astoundingly, in these really dark days that Jim and I are talking about, becoming a player coach and therefore the first head coach in the NFL in 1921. And so we didn't have another black head coach in the NFL until 1989. And for many of the reasons I described earlier, there's this huge gap. And then, as Tim mentioned, in 2001, Tony Dungy was fired, and Dennis Green of the Vikings was fired, and we were down to one black head coach out of 32 in the year 2001 when 75% of the players are black. So clearly something had to be done. And so these lawyers got together, Cyrus Mary and Johnny Cochran, who were mentioned. They put together a report, and I'll just briefly state there's an economist at the University of Pennsylvania put the report together, and it showed, as a statistical matter, that black coaches were performing better than white coaches. They were winning more games per season than white coaches. They were going to the playoffs more frequently than white coaches. Very few of them got the jobs, but those who did were winning more. And the conclusion was not that black coaches are innately better than white coaches, obviously. The conclusion was that they were denied promotions for so long, and they were assistants, apprentices for so long as a consequence of that, that they were better when they got the opportunity. Stands to reason. And so these lawyers put together a report laying out these stats, and they had a press conference, and this former Cleveland Browns player, former Dallas Cowboy front office executive vice president named John Wooten, he's now retired, saw the report, and he called up Cyrus, and he said, if you're serious about this, then let's talk. And little did Cyrus know that John, was probably the most respected and well-known person in the NFL community that the general public doesn't know about. So John and Cyrus got together, and Johnny joined them, and John basically said, all right, what do we need to do? Yeah. And he was like, I'll get the guys. And so he convened all of these coaches that you're talking about, Marvin Lewis and Tony Dungy and former Hall of Fame players, Warren Moon, the quarterback, and Kellen Winslow Sr., the tight end out of San Diego, and others. And they came into a room, and they said, we can't sit down anymore. It's not fair. If we want to have careers in the league after playing, we have to stand up. And there were some people who were afraid. They were afraid that they would lose their assistant coaching positions. And others said, no, we have to fight. And so they decided to fight. And so that takes you inside, and I don't want to, I could talk about that meeting at the Indianapolis Hyatt during the Combine literally for 2 hours. I won't bore you all with it, but it was an extraordinary organizing meeting. But what came out of that meeting was a demand that we're going to the NFL to demand change. And here's what's interesting, and I'll toss it back to you, but this is where what you all said about Bill Nunn and the interaction between Dan Rooney and Bill Nunn becomes very interesting and contemporary, because these players and lawyers threatened the league with a lawsuit. And the league had an option. The league could either say, go pound sand and we'll see you in court, or the league could say, you know what, we recognize we've got a problem, let's talk. And the league did what Dan Rooney did with Bill Nunn several decades earlier. The league said, we know we have a problem, let's talk. And Dan really influenced that, that decision. And from those talks, from those conversations, were born a number of initiatives, among them, and foremost among them, the Rooney Rule. But I don't know if things developed the way they did if Dan Rooney wasn't in the room and channeled what he had learned was the right way to build an organization, from that conversation with Bill Nunn through the cultural changes he implemented with the Steelers that made them the best club at the time in the league.
Jim, I want to get your perspective on that, but first, let everybody know how you know so much about what went on in this room, and what was your role in all of this? Yeah.
And where'd you go to school?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Someplace.
Well, that's funny. So Jim always kids me. I went to law school at Harvard, and so Jim always trolls me about it, kids me about it.
No one who went to Harvard ever tells you that they went to Harvard.
Except now. And now I'll shout it from the rooftops, because
Okay,
Harvard is the first university to come out and punch back against these attacks that are being made against the rule of law and against education in this country, freedom of education. So I'm very, very proud of that. How I know so much about what I've described, I was a young associate at Cyrus Mary's law firm. And so the book that I wrote, I was, I wrote myself out of the book, but I actually was involved in some of those conversations and some of those meetings.
What do you think, Jim, about what he was positing, that that the Rooney Rule, that the Fritz Pollard Alliance, that the courage that it took the men in the room to stand up and say, we're going to stand up for this, but also the NFL's willingness to say, yeah, we hear you and we realize there's something wrong in our house that we need to fix. Are all those things connected?
Yeah, I certainly believe that they are. I think that there were a number of people. Jeff Pash, who was the attorney at the NFL, Paul Tagliabue, who was the commissioner at the time. I think you had. Look, Pete Rozelle was changed the sporting landscape. So I'm never going to criticize Commissioner Rozelle, but I think Paul had come in, Commissioner Tagliabue had come in, Jeff had come in. Dan was a little older at this point, but not where we kind of think about him the last kind of 10 years of his life. And I think you had folks that had not only kind of been inspired by the civil rights era, but now were past it and looking into real significant endeavors that went beyond, as I said, sort of those monumental pioneering efforts. But how are we going to inculcate these things? How are we going to make these things real? How do we make them sustainable? And Tagliabue had done that as a lawyer before he got into the NFL. Pash was his understudy as a lawyer, and then as we've all said, Dan had done it with the Steelers. What I also think about that's interesting is I talk about this legacy of the chief, but the chief, I think, had a lot of different partners and tried to work with black men in business and everything else, but it really wasn't happening in the world yet. Where my father saw the starts of it, and he becomes a mentor to Tony Dungy, and then on the collective bargaining, which is really the biggest thing he did for the league, was negotiating with labor. The guy across the table from him was Gene Upshaw, and he and Gene had many battles, but they had a collegial relationship the whole time. So there was this supporting Gene. I don't want to say helping Gene, supporting Gene as he stood up in his role. You had, we talked about Bill Nunn. You had John Wooten, and John Wooten and my dad spent, so much time working on the implementation of the Rooney Rule. But over and over again, he seemed to understand that there is a role as an ally or an advocate before we ever knew those terms, because each of these men that I talked about had every capability to be successful in what they did, but they really were the first on the business side doing these things. And so I hope and I think those transformations led to the whole group of folks. When I've heard folks tell me the story of that room that Jeremy talked about, and there was a great coach coached the Redskins and the Browns for a while named Terry Robisky, and the story is that Terry stood up and said, if heads are going to roll, let my head roll first. And the willingness to be in a room and say that amongst your colleagues, and I think that was because there had been sort of a step forward in leadership roles prior to that, and there were some folks that were good allies in making that happen.
We talked about Jeremy and how he knows all this, but let's talk about you, Jim. What was you were in a lot of these rooms too, right? You were there, you saw all this. You sort of talk about it almost in the third person like Jeremy does, but.
Well, I remember I was in a meeting with, my dad brought me into a meeting. It was Commissioner Tagliabue, my dad, and Robert Kraft was actually there, and we're talking about what do we do, and I'm trying to make the case to create some type of forum, some type of ongoing educational program. And Tagliabue had said, I've seen these all throughout the 70s. They didn't work. We're not going to do them. So I get shot down with my one idea that I bring to the table. But now Arthur Blank, who was part of the committee that brought the Rooney Rule about, is running an effort like this for the league every year So I haven't given Tag a hard time that, you should have followed my idea.
Yeah.
But no, I had the chance to be with Dad in so many of these things because Art had to do the work. So I kind of was my dad's bagman. And I just got the chance to see him. And it was always pretty cool to see someone from the black community just say, we really appreciate that you fought for this. And my father, I think he always understood, like, this fight shouldn't be what it was. But to see that reaction, or to see someone from labor say, look, Dan Rooney was always on the other side of us. He was on management's side. But I remember the players rep for the Buffalo Bills said, all the other owners treated us like we smelled. And Dan Rooney treated us with respect. He negotiated for management, but he said, he'd sit down and have lunch with us and talk about our kids. And these are really simple things, but when you think about it, they're the things that got these negotiations going because someone had treated folks, with humanity. So, I think that was the thing that made Dan Rooney trustworthy. It wasn't that I think he was pretty smart, but it wasn't some genius idea. It was that undying commitment to respect, which is your book. I think your book really points out that when we find that respect for humanity, we can see change, and it's very, very successful. And we don't. We always seem to backslide.
Yeah, thank you for that. You point out too that your father was focused more on the long picture, as Tim put it, the long arc of history. And it's difficult in a time like this to keep that in mind, the long arc of history, when you see so much going the other direction. But I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit as well, your father's perspective that, wasn't worried necessarily about wins and losses on any given Sunday, or even in an entire season, but was more thinking about the long-term strategy and the long-term picture. And how important is that to keep that long perspective?
Well, now he hated to lose.
Okay.
When we would play Monopoly at home, and if he didn't win, he wasn't happy. So, my father was very, very competitive, and the chief was even more so. But I think they both sort of had this understanding that transformation isn't, it's not a transactional endeavor. And if these problems have the multitude that they have, the complexity they have, the layers that they have, that's not just going to go away in a second. So if you're really going to be committed, you have to be willing to look far down the horizon, and you have to understand there's going to be setbacks. What I think that he did, so there was that viewpoint that you brought up in your question. I think the other thing that he did that was so good that we all don't like to do, and if this word offends anyone, I apologize, but he stepped into the mess. He always understood that this was going to be messy. There was no pretty way to deal with these hard problems. And I'm patting the three of us on the back here, but we all spend time writing books about the mess. And I think we have to wade into the mess if we're going to get through the mess. I don't think you can go around the mess, or you can design, beyond it. You have to go through it.
I'm going to ask Jeremy for your perspective on that in a moment. Then I'm going to turn to the audience. I would love to hear your questions and thoughts too, and to broaden this conversation. But how do you feel about stepping into the mess? And are we in it? Do you have to be in it? Are we always in it? I thought we were a post-racial society after we elected a black president. What happened? Didn't happen.
I don't know if I just say, it's a mess. It's a mess. And I think one thing that we see, we can go back further than the 1920s. We can go and, I often wonder, Civil War ends, and you've got, at least as a legal matter, emancipation, and you've got a Reconstruction period. I don't know who studied the Reconstruction period, but the Reconstruction period was a period of tremendous opportunity for black people. You had increased political strength. You had people getting into the United States Senate. You had local government leadership, and then born of the strength there, you had communities blossoming. You know, you had the black community in Tulsa that they call Black Wall Street. And what did Reconstruction? What came after Reconstruction? Well, the tremendous strengthening of the Ku Klux Klan, the legitimization at the time of lynchings as a means of disincentivizing the very rights that Reconstruction was designed to produce. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, and this is something that really has been written out of the history books. And if people don't know what I'm talking about, I commend you to do a little research tonight. Was literally bombed to smithereens and destroyed. Yeah. And so then you move forward and you get into the middle of the previous century. You've got the Civil Rights Movement. You got Brown versus the Board of Education. And you move toward the Civil Rights Statutes of the 1960s, and you see progress, and you see the beginnings of some economic strength in the black community, and it seems that things are a lot better. And then you find yourself in 2020 when George Floyd is killed, and there are riots across the country, and the country's burning down. And then it makes you think as a historical matter to the 1960s, the 1920s, and the late 1800s. So I don't mean to bring a cloud over this gathering, but we have a long history of steps forward and steps back.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
to answer your question, we have to step into the mess.
Yeah.
Because if you don't step into the mess, then the mess is going to get bigger and worse.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Let me turn it over to the audience. Anybody have a question? Marcus is one of my students, and he always has a question. Wants to be a sports broadcaster. Yeah, let me give you a mic here. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
As Professor Conte had said, my name is Marcus Betts. Now, we have this sort of revolution in position-wise, as far as on-the-field positions. Do you see, for black athletes, do you see a reality, this is just hypothetical, do you see a reality where we see potentially a black commissioner or more black owners in league positions?
You want me to go first or you, Jim? Okay. Well, maybe you should go first on this one. You want me to go first?
Sure, I'll go.
Yeah, you go first.
All right. Look, I think the reality is, because of so many of the pieces of the conversation we've had, it's much more likely that we would have a minority commissioner than minority owner. And that is because the requirements to own an NFL team now, you have to essentially have somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $5 billion in cash, and we have not created opportunities where there's a whole lot of minorities that have that type of capital. So the rules of the NFL really preclude much opportunity. I don't want to say there's no opportunity of a minority ownership in that way. Now the Steelers in our investment, our investment team. John Stallworth is part of it, and we have two other minority shareholders who have minority shares who also come from a minority experience. But I think the pathway of changing that, if someone who has the $10 billion, et cetera, wants to buy a team, I think that's a pathway. But I actually think it's probably more likely to get a minority commissioner, which I think would be fantastic for the league.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that analysis. I'll add on. I think, it's the barrier to entry to owning an NFL club is just ridiculous. I mean, your grandfather would, if these were the sorts of barriers, your grandfather in the business, he wouldn't have had it. But I kind of analogize. I try thinking about the long game, as you have talked about. There are other leagues that aren't where the barrier to entry isn't as high, but that may end up growing in a way that you can get in now and then it grows. And so it's like, for example, what does it cost to buy one share of Alphabet, of Google? A whole lot. But what does it cost to buy a share of NVIDIA? Less. And what does it cost to buy the most recent tech startup? Even less. But in 20 years, that recent tech startup could be the next Alphabet, the next Google. So you buy a Major League Soccer club, or you buy a National Women's Soccer League club, or you buy a WNBA club. And we don't know where these leagues go, but it could be that in 50 years, those leagues have grown to a point where there's no way that, the barrier to entry is so high, but you're in it because you got to be in it, like the chief got to be in it when the barrier to entry wasn't so high. So I do agree. I think a commissioner's more likely, but I think for those, people of color interested in getting into sports ownership, there are other avenues with extraordinarily high upside if you pick the right, horse.
One thing was, when I was reading both of your books and thinking about the courage of these people who stood up, and particularly the Fritz Pollard Alliance and John Wooten, as you mentioned, what happened with Colin Kaepernick and that whole idea that he took the big risk for himself? He goes out there, kneels during the anthem, but then never plays in the NFL again. And is that a different situation, or is it just the thing was, here's somebody who put his career on the line? How do you view that in this broader context of sports and social justice?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Well, I think it's wildly unfair. First of all, I think that there are people who have had long careers in every major professional sports league in this country, including the National Football League, who have done egregious things, sometimes heinous things. Yeah, Mike's coming to you right there on the right side.
Oh, hello.
And Colin Kaepernick was not given the opportunity to play. He did not what he did was neither egregious nor heinous. And what's so interesting is, what he did, he said, it's one of these things where, we're in this world, as we've discussed, where, once upon a time people agreed on what the facts were, then you argued about the facts. But, Colin Kaepernick, he began his protest by sitting down during the anthem. And he was encouraged by, among other individuals, a punter in the league who was a former armed service member. Please don't sit, that might be viewed as disrespectful. Kneel. And so Colin Kaepernick began kneeling. When asked about it, he said, listen, I've got family members who are in the armed services. I've got family members who are police officers. I have great respect for them. What I'm doing is I am protesting that there are disproportionate outcomes in the criminal justice system for black people in this country. That's what I'm doing. I'm not protesting against, the armed services. I'm not protesting against anybody. But the narrative was lost. It just didn't gain traction because everybody said you're stepping on the flag, you're spitting on the flag, you're spitting on the armed services. And he was ushered out of he just wasn't given another opportunity to play in the league. His contract ended. He wasn't given another opportunity. Now, interestingly, along with Colin, Eric Reed kneeled, his teammate. He was a cornerback. He went on to play for two other clubs and continue his career. Michael Bennett, the lineman, was very, very outspoken. He kneeled. He held up a fist during the anthem. He continued with his career. I think that the American public needed a villain in it And it was going to be Kaepernick, and it was Kaepernick. And the pressures were so great that no NFL ownership group was willing to take it on. I think the Ravens came close. And then it's too long a story, but some unfortunate things were done on social media that kind of unhinged the possibility there. The Falcons talked about it, but in the end, each year that passed, he was getting older, and he was getting further away from the game, and so it became easier to dismiss the possibility of him playing in the game again. But I think the whole saga was very unfortunate, and I think that his message was purposefully mangled in a way that disserved the conversation and disserved him.
The couple things from tonight's discussion really resonated with me from my own work on my own book. What you mentioned earlier about how long it took these leagues to reintegrate, or in the case of Major League Baseball, to integrate. That we think about Jackie Robinson. Okay, Major League Baseball's integrated, problem solved. But then it takes decades for that to happen. But the other piece is that with people who espouse a racist ideology, who are vocal and outspoken about it, but at the same time can be fans of sports athletes. And there's a weird paradox or conflict in which people set their personal beliefs aside. And I just think about when Satchel Paige starts pitching, he was big deals because fans wanted to come see him pitch. Even fans who would have said earlier, we don't want any blacks in the league, but now they're saying, no, we want to come see because he's so talented and it transforms the sport. And Jim, I'm just wondering how you square all that when Steelers Nation, right? When I think about Southwestern Pennsylvania can be so divided at times. We just came out of this political season every 4 years, and people are so divided. But on Sundays, everybody across Southwestern Pennsylvania is a Steelers fan, right? And we can all stand together, and in those 3 or 4 hours of the game, you can stand, shoulder to shoulder with somebody who you normally wouldn't maybe even talk to or feel you had anything in common with. That's an incredible trust for your family to bear.
Well, if we lose, everyone's together on Monday, even more so on a certain level.
Yeah.
But I guess what comes up for me, and again, I don't, I like talking about my dad, but I don't want to. I am making this more than I guess I'd like about these things, but these stories are just hitting me now. The day I remember kind of learning about race was with one of my sisters who passed away about 20 years ago now, Kathleen. And Kathleen was she was funny and loud and just had all those qualities. We're at a pizza place in the South Hills, and there's 5 or 6 of us. There were 9 kids, so about half of us. And there's a group next to us. This is 75, 76, and they're all wearing Steeler stuff, and they're using the N-word, and it's just happening out there. And my sister gets up, and she couldn't have been older than 22, 23, and gave them a few words and said, all that stuff you're wearing, all the guys you're cheering for are black guys, and they have wives, and they have children, and they have mothers, and they have fathers. And that moment struck me, and then that was a moment that I started to understand something that now I try to spend my time advocating for. But that was the moment, and it had to do with the Steelers. And look, I love Steeler fans. I'm grateful to Steeler fans, but that behavior in that moment was where I got the chance to wake up, and it's something I'll never forget. And then I had the amazing opportunity to have. Joe had retired, but I knew Joe Green, Franco's last 2 seasons. I was a ball boy. Mel Blount called me last night on the phone. I grew up with my heroes, and it was as I got older, it was after their careers that I got to share time with them as they were doing things in the community where they would share some of these stories and some of these experiences. And it's an amazing privilege in my life that I get to hear such personal stories from guys that were also my heroes growing up, and the courage that so many of those guys showed. Mel Blount tells a story. I think he'd be okay with me telling it. If not, he'll call me tonight and tell me. But he went to Southern, which is in Louisiana, and he's from Georgia. And so he would drive home from college, as you do. And, there were no real interstates back then. And he would plan his trip based on trying to get from point A to point B, take him about 2 days, to make sure that, he wasn't going to go through places at night where he felt there might, and this is 1967, 68, but that he was afraid that there were places that he could get lynched or run into a Klan rally or something like that, because there was a reverberation from the civil rights era. But this is a guy we've all cheered for. Many of us know him, and this was the experience he had when he was 22, 23 years old. So so it's an honor for me to be able to have witnessed and hear them tell those stories to me, and it's troubling to think that that was their experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Before I forget to, I just want to say that listening to you talk about the players as your heroes and talking like a fan, like the rest of us are, I just want to say how much I appreciate you and your family for taking this compact that you have with the fans and with the public so seriously, and that everyone in the family that I've ever dealt with has always been so generous and so welcoming, and it carries through. It's not just the brand, it's reality. So thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Well, now I'll be a little bit of a smart aleck. The chief was so I got to drive my grandfather around a lot when I turned 16, 17, 18 years old. Everyone else was kind of moving on, and he had guys that would drive him, but I did a lot of sort of the backup driving. And he was a tough son of a gun. So he was great to everyone in the community. But I remember I made a wrong turn once, and he goes, "What are you doing?" He really would give it to you. So I always laugh because he would have kicked our ass if we didn't act the way that he always, and my father, saw this as stewardship. And look, there's money involved, and all of those things. There's an economic reality to the team and the business side, but he and my father saw this as a stewardship, and a stewardship to do the things that we're talking about. It's nice to hear nice things about my father, my family, and I tell them because that's the perspective I have. But the stories of Mel Blount, the stories of Tony Dungy, the stories of Mike Tomlin, Franco. We all know the story of Franco protesting the Ku Klux Klan rally here in Pittsburgh. Those were as important to my father and my grandfather, and that they were facilitating that. Not that they it wasn't about them. And sometimes I think when I talk maybe too much about them, but that's the perspective I have. But that was a responsibility, not just to have a team and have a team that we expect to win, but to have a team that you expect to have people that are trying to make a difference in the community.
Yep. Thank you. Time for one or two more questions? Yeah.
I just have one, just because I'm a little bit out of the loop here. I know I'm sorry. I know enough. I know the Eagles won the Super Bowl. I went to Penn State, Barkley, all that stuff. Whatever happened with visiting with the president? Did that happen? Didn't he invite him to the White House?
Did the Eagles go to the White House?
Did it? Yeah. Whatever happened?
It hasn't happened yet.
Is it going to happen?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because there were reports initially that they wouldn't go if they won. This was before the game.
Okay.
And then after they won, there's some sort of a release or statement that the reports that they wouldn't go weren't accurate. I don't think they affirmatively said they would go, but they said the reports they would not go weren't accurate. So we'll see what happens. I will say that Ohio State went recently, and the vice president dropped the trophy all over the ground, which is an interesting visual. But yeah, no, it's interesting because I don't know how this tradition began of going to the White House, but it's become quite a politicized thing. It certainly was during the previous administration. We'll see. We'll see what happens now.
I heard that the tradition was started by Jimmy Carter when he brought the Steelers and Pirates together.
Oh, well.
Really?
I don't know if that's true, but I recollect that I heard that somewhere because it's a great honor. But he wanted to win Western Pennsylvania. There was an objective
That's
to it.
interesting.
We're going to track that down. Yeah.
I'm going to put a research assistant on that,
I
Jim.
was
We're
gonna
going
say,
to find that.
Among the three of us, we should be able to figure that out. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious whether, we know the Rooney Rule has been in place for more than 2 decades now. The other major sports, Major League Baseball, NBA, do they have similar apparatus? And if not, are you guys disappointed that that's not in place?
So different leagues taking different approaches. It's interesting. So the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which we talked about, the idea for the Fritz Pollard Alliance was born. There's a gentleman named Ken Shropshire who Jim and I both know. I wrote a book with him. He's been a bit of a mentor to me. He's a lawyer who works in the sport and society space.
Professor at Penn. I know you guys like these
Professor
Ivy
Penn,
League.
yeah, he's a professor of Penn. And he, in the mid-'80s, what we were seeing happening in the NFL, when we were dealing with around the year 2000, in the mid-'80s, you were seeing that in Major League Baseball. The first manager of color in Major League Baseball was 1975, Frank Robinson. Wow. Yeah, and you didn't see much more after that. In the mid-'80s, a lot of people were feeling like this is unfair. And so Ken worked with a bunch of former coaches and administrators and players in Major League Baseball, and they formed what's called the Baseball Network. And it was an organization of coaches and scouts and executives of color, Major League Baseball, trying to work toward getting, increasing the opportunities for people of color in the managing level in baseball. I should point out, actually, when it was born, I don't know if folks remember, there was a vice president for the LA Dodgers who said that blacks didn't have the necessities to be manager. So that sparked this movement. And out of the Baseball Network came a very loose form of the Rooney Rule before the Rooney Rule that wasn't really applied consistently, but it was there. And after the Rooney Rule came into place, Major League Baseball didn't create a new rule, but they tried to apply their rule with greater fidelity. Major League Soccer has a rule born of the Rooney Rule, also not applied very well. And the NFL hasn't, the NFL clubs have been great at applying it, but they've done better than most other sports teams. The NBA doesn't have any such rule, but they've got greater diversity than anybody else among head coaches. And I think a part of that is, well, one, the playing population, as high as the percentage of black players in the NFL is, it's higher in the NBA. So that creates a certain pressure. But also the ownership in the NBA leans less conservative than the ownership across the board in the NFL. I would go so far as to say the Rooneys are a bit of an outlier among NFL owners in terms of being progressive in the way that they've been. In the NBA, you've got more owners of that ilk, and so kind of organically and naturally, there is a norm of interviewing and considering candidates of color in a way that seems to not require that a rule be in place. And I'll say that as of a couple years ago, 50% of the NBA head coaches were black. Now that's stepped back from that a little bit, but they're doing quite well.
Well, we've run long tonight, and a lot of that's because this conversation's been so great. I appreciate the two of you. Somehow we got through almost 80 minutes of Steelers talk and didn't talk about quarterback or that Rodgers fellow at all that didn't come up. And thank you
We
to
kept
the
it
audience.
civil.
Yeah, kept it civil. Thank you for coming out and supporting these types of events. I appreciate it. We've had a range of events. This is obviously one of our smaller ones, but we're going to bring it back in the fall. We're going to have a discussion, 4 events next year. And if you have any feedback, please, seek me out and provide the feedback. We'd love to hear it. But please join me in thanking Tim and these guys.